Hello, transmission listeners. And today is actually the first day that I will be starting off this podcast. I think we're 13 episodes in so far. It's Thursday. Tonight we're going to have a full moon. So it should just be a really weird episode for me and Sebastian. It's Sebastian for the first time ever. You tell me how your week has been so far.
It's been pretty great. It's been pretty busy. There's always so many things to cover in this space. I'm very happy to have you start us off. It's been too long. I don't know why we waited this long to have you. We should just do it. We swap out every other week. That's how we should be doing this thing. So I'm excited to be here for this. And today's gonna be good.
You know, it's funny you said that too, because I went through and I counted the episodes, and I was even honestly flabbergasted when I counted 12, 13 of them. So, let's start doing that. We'll just start ping-ponging the beginning of it. But really, I'm really excited this week because you and I have been working on our first webinar with our sponsor and our favorite supply chain logistics company in the auto space, AIT Worldwide Logistics. And so for all of our listeners, tomorrow, this will be Wednesday, June 30th, we're going to be hosting a webinar with some of our past guests, Conway Jeffers and Alan Votaw, and we'll be just discussing a number of emerging trends that we're seeing within auto suppliers when it comes to their logistics and their logistics spend, diving into a lot of cross-border, trans-border changes, and especially for AIT, a number of new mergers and acquisitions that they've had come on board that will now they'll offer to their customers. So it should be super interesting. Make sure that you guys go and sign up for that. Go to either FreightWaves.com, either of our social media pages, or our recent newsletter, and you guys can quickly sign up for that. But in the meantime, let's hear from our sponsors at AIT.
When you switch to AIT Worldwide Logistics for automotive shipping, you're partnering with a team of logistics professionals in Asia, Europe, and North America who develop customized supply chain solutions that are just as unique as your business. Whether it's trans-border, hotshot trucking, express ocean service, or an exclusive air charter, AIT has the expertise, technology, and carrier connections to achieve your production goals every time. Check out their link in the show notes.
All right, now for our special guest today, we have Riley Brennan. He's actually the general partner at Trucks Venture Capital. Has been responsible in the past for communications and content for GM. He has an extensive background in investment within autonomous vehicles. To name a few, we have May Mobility, which I've seen in Grand Rapids a ton, Gatik, and DeepScale, which actually ended up being acquired by Tesla. So I thought it'd be really fun to bring him on today to talk a little bit more about the investments within automakers and really how that's starting to affect their supply chains. I would also recommend that you guys, after this, go and sign up for his FOT, Future of Transportation newsletters. I've heard rave reviews on them from a number of people. So all of the automotive manufacturer fans out there, or just automotive fans in general, I would definitely reach out to that. But Riley, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you introduce yourself a little bit and really where your passion in automotive has come from in your past work?
Sure. Great. Thanks for having me, Grace and Sebastian. Really appreciate being here. It's awesome to chat with you. I grew up just as a kid loving cars, so I had posters of cars on my wall. I'm a child of the 80s, so frankly, the American cars in that era were pretty bad. So I was kind of into European cars and Volkswagens and stuff like that in the mid 80s. And I always thought I wanted to work in the car industry. And when I was an undergrad at University of Michigan, I worked at a car magazine back when print media actually made money. And so I was a little gopher, and I would wash and gas cars that these people were going to go and test drive. And it was the most fun you could have in Ann Arbor, Michigan, making $7 an hour legally in the late 90s. So that's kind of how I got started in the auto industry. And then about 6 years ago, I started a venture fund called Trucks, which we can talk about. So I've kind of 25 years in the auto industry of transportation, coming at it from different angles. And I love all sorts of stuff, from bikes to race cars to planes.
That's awesome. Yeah, I wanted to mention Joby, but I figured we keep the taxis here on ground before we start talking about the air. So I really appreciate you coming on, and let's start this conversation a little bit more broad. Can you tell us so far what you've seen in the state of play within auto manufacturers and the different investments that you've seen them make when it comes to these autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, I would say, to be candid, the reason we started our venture fund, which is called Trucks, the reason we started it is because we didn't see a lot of the larger auto supply chain investing in things like robotics. So that was actually why we started our fund, because nobody else was doing it. And so we thought, wow, there's a lot of great talent here, and these people are working on things that, the suppliers and the OEMs are not doing. And these little companies need financing. So that was kind of the seed corn of us getting our little thing off the ground called Trucks. But of course, after GM bought Cruise in 2016, 5 years ago, it feels like everybody has had some sort of autonomy investment or acquisition or strategy related to AVs. And the big change, I would say, is that engineers always thought that autonomy would take about 20 years or 25 years. But the auto execs were the ones that said, 2020, we're going to have a fleet of robotaxis and you can sell all the gas stations and everything's going to change. And that didn't happen because it's actually 2021 right now. And so I think the engineers working on these problems have always been realistic about the timelines, and the executives have always been over optimistic. But my point of view on this is, if you were in 2016 saying that you were going to have a fleet of robotaxis in 4 years, most CEOs only last for 3 or 4 years. So it's like they knew they were going to be playing golf in Boca Raton anyway. So what did it matter to them to make that pronouncement? But we can talk about that a little bit. But so the timelines have, kind of stayed the same depending on who you talk to, or moved back depending on if you're talking to an executive. But they've all been involved in the space. I think the reality of it is there's much more development to be done and investment to be done at the less than level 4 kind of automation, so level 1 through 3. And there's a lot of companies and things that still have to be built. So we have investments across the whole landscape, from full automation companies on road to off of roads, like with agriculture, mining, and parts and pieces in between.
That's great. I just remembered a quote I read of yours about how you don't think that we'll get to level 5 because robots, unlike humans, know that they can't drive perfectly in all types of weather. So it was an interesting take as well that had me laughing for a little bit.
Well, only humans are dumb enough to think they can drive in every condition, right? So like the level 5 promise is that you can go anywhere at any time, kind of. And you're like, stupid cousin who wants to get on I-94, who's 17 years old and wants to drive through an ice storm to Chicago in the middle of the night. They'll do that. But a robot is actually way smarter than that and will say, actually, don't think this is a good idea. I'm going to not drive tonight and tell you that we're going to go tomorrow. And that's the big difference between level 4 and level 5 in my mind, which is why I think we'll never have level 5 because the robots are too smart.
Yeah. Super interesting take. So one thing I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on, we talked in the last episode and a couple episodes in the past as well about the more of the technologies now being inserted into cars and the connectivity between them. And last episode, we discussed more of the aftermarket demand and how the parts demand will go down, but a lot of these manufacturers are starting to invest more into these as a service cloud services within these vehicles. Could you dive into that a little bit from your take on the investment side and maybe players you see that are starting to invest in this a little bit more, and what manufacturers are kind of leading the front?
Well, it's interesting because of the companies that make cars today, whether you're talking about a manufacturer or supplier, they only capture about a third of the value of the money that goes into the total ownership of the car, right? So 2/3 of all the money that gets sunk into a new vehicle happens after you buy it, in service, maintenance, other things that you might put in aftermarket. And that's really interesting. And for about, call it 75 years, everybody's been happy with that arrangement. Although most manufacturers at one point or another thought they wanted to have a really deep connection into maintenance, service, after sales. And so the big change that a lot of these companies are trying to figure out is, how can I get the other 2/3, right? And so the natural, sort of movement is toward, well, let's sell people software inside the vehicle that might do things like allow you to have hands-free driving temporarily. And if you pay me a monthly service, whether it's Tesla Autopilot or Ford Blue Cruise or something like that, you could potentially have this additional capability and I can make more money. The challenge is that vehicles actually aren't really architected that well today to do that kind of stuff. So you can have a lot of great ideas about software to sell customers. You could even have things that look great in a demo, but the re-architecting of how the vehicles are actually connected inside and the sort of behind the scenes guts of how a vehicle is really laid out, those are the things that you have to do first before you even earn the right to sell this kind of software. So we'll see over time, and I think in a very actually condensed period of time, that the vehicle architecture moves from 100 ECUs from many different manufacturers and a sort of rat's nest of code into fewer computers, into maybe at some point one centralized computer. But when you get to those kind of decisions and those hard kind of architectural moves, then you can unlock a lot of software. But until then, it's hard to do it.
I was just on an embargoed briefing call earlier today with a tier one supplier, talking almost about this exact same thing, about simplifying the architecture of their vehicles, or of the vehicles that they're helping OEMs build. So that makes total sense to me, that what you're saying there. What I wanted to ask about though is, and Grace brought this up earlier, but some of the different things that your VC has invested in, it really runs the gamut. And you said yourself, your experience in your industry, the automotive industry, is very broad. Is sort of the investments that your company is making, are they kind of a safe play in that we're going to invest in all these different things, from flying air taxis, like you mentioned, to agriculture, to the autonomous vehicles, just because there's a lot there? Or is it because you see all of these pieces fitting together at some point down the road and you just want a little piece of them now so that when they do come together, it'll be a real success story?
That's a great question. Frankly, the reason why we have the breadth is pretty big for us is because transportation isn't really one category. It's actually about 17 different markets, and they're very cyclical markets, right? So I have a friend who only really invests in new car dealership kind of real estate. And it can be a great business for about 36 months. And then for about 48 months, it's an awful business. But you have to live the other 48 months. And so you can take advantage of that, right? So there are parts of all these different transportation markets, whether we're talking about logistics or we're talking about aviation or new cars or used cars or maintenance or security, that are all on different cycles. And I think it's our job as somebody who invests over a long period of time in transportation that we just have to take advantage of it. And the curious part about what we do is we're seed stage investors. So almost every single investment that we make is too early. It looks too early, and it often looks like a bad idea the day we make the investment. And then in the cases where we're right, it looks a lot more obvious 6 or 7 years from now. But when we first make them, it's like either it's too early or something else is wrong with that part of the market. And so that's kind of an unusual thing. But we've done, we certainly have done a lot in ground automation. We've invested in more automated vehicle companies than literally anyone, which means that I've also made more mistakes about automated vehicle investing than anybody too. And we've invested in aviation and in bicycles and small vehicles. And so we like that breadth. I think if we only did one thing, we would either, one, get bored of it, or two, we would fall into a cycle of 4 or 5 years and it would be really difficult. So those are some of the reasons why we have this somewhat of a liberal arts approach within transportation.
It's really interesting. Yeah, it's freight and transportation is constantly going through those ebbs and flows. So it's good that you guys are thinking about that as well. I wanted to point out a tweet that you actually had this week that I just loved because I knew it would cause a really interesting conversation in the thread. But you tweeted earlier this week, do all global vehicle manufacturers end up making their own chips and batteries? I'm interested in what your thoughts were because you just posed the question. You didn't really dive into your own answer. And there was, some interesting back and forth in the thread as well. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that and the trends that you're seeing in investment for that as well.
Well, I guess one of the things about the R&D done in an automaker is that discussion of what you should be doing yourself versus what suppliers do for you has evolved a lot. And so if you go back in time, automakers were very vertical. They did almost everything themselves. And the idea of a supplier ecosystem actually emerged pretty early on. Like if you think about the origin of Dodge, for example, like they were supplying parts for Ford, and then they ultimately became their own company. So it's interesting, like the auto industry, in its first wave 100 years ago, started to build out this ecosystem. And over time, different parts of a company would be brought in-house. And you can make the argument of, maybe the stuff that's more valuable or we can capture more margin, we should try to do ourselves. And the question is meant to provoke, I think, this same idea, which is, I think that if you can control the chips and the batteries, you're going to either control more of the shortages we've seen. So you maybe be less susceptible to the global semi shortages if you controlled your own manufacturing of chips. On the battery side and on the pack side, I'm not sure if it's a good idea for every manufacturer to do it, but I think there's probably an argument to be made within the larger companies to do it to capture more of the margin. And it's interesting because, and I'd love to hear both of your takes on this, but it used to be that electrification was just a part of what the automobile business was going to sort of do at some point. And now I feel like electrification is the business of passenger cars, at least, not talking about commercial trucks yet, but just passenger cars. It's so much about electrification. In fact, that's the entirety of the business. And so if the entirety of the business is this thing called electrification, and you're farming out all of your electrification to your suppliers, is that the way you really want to build your company? And whether you're talking about automobiles or software or any other industry, you'd want to own the stuff that's the most important part of the business. So I'd love to hear what Grace and Sebastian, what you guys think.
Sebastian, I think you can knock this one out of the park. Yeah.
I was just saying,
go for it.
To me, it just makes me worry for all of the startups and the EV startups. And we've seen time and time again, me having covered them forever over at Autoblog Green, like there's all these startups that want to do something with electric vehicles. And obviously Tesla's a big one that is still around. And we have other examples of either, like Lordstown having trouble right now, or Aptera sort of making it big 10, 15 years ago, and now they're still kind of coming back. Like the things you're talking about having these big investments in your own chips, your own batteries, whatever it is, like that's not always a thing a startup can figure out right away. They need to buy it from someone. And Tesla had its Panasonic deal, et cetera, et cetera. Like to me, when we talk about those sort of vertical investments these companies are making, I think the startups would be the ones who'd be shaking in their boots, really.
Right. I agree. I think it has to be the sport of kings who could pull that off, right? Because you're talking about 11-figure investments in these sort of projects. There's an enormous amount of money involved, to the point where you wouldn't do a new vehicle platform because of these decisions. And my point of view on a lot of these if you were an auto CEO, although it looks like you have a lot of decisions to make, you really only have a few big decisions to make per year, which are these huge capital allocation decisions. And it usually comes down to like, do I greenlight this one $7 billion vehicle platform idea or this other one? Or do I build 3 plants instead of 4? And so these kind of the marble sizes that you're playing with as a CEO at these large companies, you really only have a handful of these decisions. Now, when you make autonomy investments or you make electrification investments, you have to take a few product marbles off the table to do those. And that could potentially be, those could be brilliant, and they could also totally kill a company. So what a time to, if you're running one of those companies. Thankfully, the three of us don't have to do that. We can just pontificate on this as we see fit.
So, speaking of CEOs making decisions within the industry, one thing that I absolutely loved writing about your VC was your no manels, right? Is getting more women involved with the space, which personally, I think that Transmission has done a really great job. So, a round of applause to Sebastian on making sure that we, allow women to come on our show and really speak on their vast decades of knowledge that they have within the space. But could you talk a little bit about why you started that and just how you promote it within your organization? Because I think it's something that all of our listeners could really learn from and quickly implement, clearly with the tool that you just made.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty simple idea, which is, I'm sure, you guys probably get invited to speak on panels. And we started to say years ago, I don't want to go to a panel where it's just all men on stage. And in the auto industry and in the financial community especially, it's usually all men on these panels. And so I would say I won't attend, and you should find another, person to fill my spot. I'd prefer it's a female, and maybe next time, if it's a more balanced sort of panel, I'll come back and speak. And what we found in the first year or two of saying that was the event organizers would say to us, well, that's interesting, but I don't know, do you know any women that could be a part of this panel? And so then we had to take the next step, which is we just built out this database of, literally hundreds of qualified women in the auto industry that are from financial community to journalists to product designers, every component. And so we built, if you go to women.trucks.vc, it's a database of them. And so now when I say no, I also follow up with, I'll decline. And then here's the list. You should call any one of these women. They're probably awesome if they're available. And that's what we do. And so the rule internally is we just don't speak on manels. And I think it's a small step, but pretty easy to do. If somebody wants me to keynote something and speak on my own, I'll go and do that. But for a dynamic group discussion, that's just the rule we have. And I think it's pretty simple to do.
Yeah. And the list is massive. That's what I loved about it, was this wasn't something you just put people that it was time and attention into it. So, plus I love that 1-2 punch. Nope, I can't. And I already know the excuse. And here's the document that's going to help you fix it. So, I loved it. Well, yeah, of course. And thank you so much for being on our show today. For all of our listeners, make sure that you guys are going and signing up for our webinar tomorrow. And also make sure that you subscribe to this podcast. Whatever you're listening to, just go ahead and click on that subscribe button so that we can notify you when we have new episodes and new events coming up. So this has been myself and Sebastian. Thank you for listening.